All right, in this video, I'll be talking about organizational strategies that you'll need to use for this second speech. These organizational strategies are actually written about in Chapter 8, which you're reading for this module, and there'll be a quiz on Chapter 8. Chapter 8 covers not only organizational strategies, but also outlining. I'll be talking about outlining in the next video, but for now, I just want to talk to you about how to organize the bodies of your speeches for speech number 2. The basic organizational strategy that we've been using so far for speech number 1 was just having 3 distinct sections of our speeches that all had different functions: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. We'll be keeping that same basic organizational strategy, but in addition to having 3 sections, I'm going to be asking that the second section, the bodies of your speeches, be organized using one of the logical strategies that are identified in Chapter 8 and covered in this lecture. So in addition to having you organize your speeches into 3 levels, introduction, body, and conclusion, you're going to have to also organize the body of your speech into 2, 3, or 4 main points that you'll develop throughout the body of that speech. So let me just talk briefly over the major parts of the second speech before I get into talking about the main points of the body of the speech. So this is the 5 main parts of the introduction. So when you craft your introduction, you'll have to have all 5 of these items listed here. The first item should be the attention getter. You're going to use one of the attention gaining strategies we've read about. I'm going to encourage you to be creative, to think outside the box, to take a risk, and to perform an attention getter that is creative, interesting, fun, intriguing. Thesis statements, we've been spending some time talking a bit about those already. Use the thesis statement that you submitted for the thesis statement assignment, and remember that it should be the main idea of your speech. Audience orientation, you won't find this in the textbook. I have talked about it in the Speech 2 prompt video, but the audience orientation is the part of the introduction where you'll give the audience a reason to listen by telling them what they can do with the information. A good audience orientation would go beyond telling your audience that they're going to learn some things. Yeah, of course, we're going to learn some things. It's an informative speech. Go beyond that and tell us, what will we be able to do with this information? So let's say you were giving a speech on the candidates for an upcoming election. You might have an audience orientation that says something along the lines of, after listening to this speech, you'll be able to more confidently vote in the upcoming midterm elections. And that's a good audience orientation because it doesn't simply tell the audience that they're going to learn something. It tells them that they'll be able to do something with that learning, confidently vote in the election. So the more actionable the audience orientation is, the better. Your ethos statement, the 4th thing listed here, is where you'll tell your audience why you're credible to talk about the topic that you're talking about. Usually there's one of 2 approaches or both of these approaches that you might take in your ethos statement. One would be identifying your own particular expertise or direct personal experience if you have direct experience with the topic. Maybe you've attended the event that you're talking about, or maybe you work at the place that you're talking about. And then the second approach to ethos that you might use would be to identify your best research. Now, you don't have to name all of the sources that you're using in your speech, but if you have some really good, solid sources, let's say the Las Vegas Review-Journal or the New York Times, you want to name those in your introduction, telling your audience that you've drawn information from those sources in preparation for this speech. And so your ethos statement might sound something like this. In order to prepare for this speech, I've done a little researching with local newspapers, including the Las Vegas Review-Journal and the Las Vegas Sun. Additionally, I also am a employee of the organization that I'll be telling you about, so I have a lot of firsthand experience with this topic. Something along those lines would be sufficient for an ethos statement. And the last thing that you need to do in the the last thing you need to do in the introduction is to preview the main points of your speech. And to do that, you're just going to simply list the main points in the order that they will appear, announcing to your audience that you intend to talk about them in this order. So something along the lines of this. I will begin my speech by first talking about Oscar Goodman's first role as a mob lawyer. I'll then turn to his career as mayor of Las Vegas, and lastly, we'll look at how Oscar Goodman became a spokesperson for Bombay Sapphire Gin. So I previewed the body of the speech by naming specifically each of the main points in the order that I plan on talking them, telling the audience that that's the order we will be going. That way, your audience hopefully is able to follow along and even remember your main points. Remember, we talked previously about an umbrella thesis statement versus a list thesis statement. Those of you who had a thesis statement that did list the main points in the thesis statement will still need to do that again in the preview. That kind of redundancy is quite all right for oral communication. So those are the 5 parts of the introduction. Be sure that you know what each of these 5 parts are doing and arrange them in the introduction of your speech. For the body of your speech, you'll need to use 2 to 4 main points, and you're going to be using subordination to indicate focus and develop your ideas. So the main point number 1 would appear in the body of your outline as Roman numeral 1. Main point number 2, Roman numeral 2. And you can go up to 4 main points depending on your particular topic and the particular organizational strategy that you choose. You'll determine the order, which ones go first, second, third, and so forth, by using one of the organizational strategies that I'll be talking about a little bit later on in this video. But for now, just know that the bodies of your speech will look something like this. You're going to focus on one main point at a time and develop that with some support details, some evidence that will help you explain those main points in greater detail. So 2 to 4 main points in the body of your speech is what we're looking for this assignment. Lastly, the conclusion of your speech should have 3 main functions: signaling the end of the speech to your audience, some type of transitional statement that signals to the audience the speech is wrapping up. There should be no surprise. You should give us a psychological signal that the speech is ending. The second thing you'll want to do in the conclusion is review the main points. This is similar to the preview in the introduction. In the preview, though, you're just going to simply name the main points. Then you'll talk about those main points in the body of your speech, which means the review, by the time you get to the end of your speech, should be a little more substantial, should contain some more details from the body of your speech, be more detailed than the preview of your speech probably was. So the second thing you want to do is review the main points. And then the last thing, you want to have a final, constructed, hopefully powerful or impactful final line of your speech that you've prepared, you've memorized, and you're able to deliver effectively so that your speech ends on a very strong note. What we want to do with this memorable end is avoid having to say something along the lines of, "That's it, that's my speech, that's all I have," or some other real direct way of ending the speech that isn't as powerful. So have a final thoughtful line, practice that line, and deliver that at the end of your speech to conclude it. So that is the three major sections of the speech: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion, and all the major parts for each of those sections that you'll need to arrange in your speech. Okay, so I want to talk now about some of the organizational strategies that you can use to organize the bodies of your speech. And what I'm going to cover in this lecture are 6 strategies: chronological ordering, spatial ordering, causal ordering, problem solution ordering, which is actually one of the ones you cannot use for speech number 2. You will be required to use a variation of problem solution for speech number 3. So I do want to show you that today, but we won't be using problem solution for speech number 2. Pro-con is actually not talked about in the textbook, but is an organizational strategy that you can use. Topical is the last one that I'll cover. It's the most common strategy. It's also discussed in the textbook. So some of these strategies, like I'm saying, are discussed in the textbook. So let me show you. I have a scan of the textbook. This is, let's see, page... Oh, I don't even know the page. This is in Chapter 8, though, on organizing. And on Table 8.3, it lists all of the organizational strategies that are discussed in Chapter 8. And many of them I'll be discussing in my lecture today. So I just wanted to point out that what I'm covering in this lecture is also discussed in the textbook. I'll cover chronological, spatial, topical. Cause and effect is what the textbook calls causal, or what I'll be calling causal. And I'll also discuss problem solution in my lecture. I won't be discussing narrative. Really, the only difference between narrative and chronological ordering is that narrative is typically used when telling a story that's dramatic in some way. So you have kind of the story arc of a typical narrative: rising action, the introduction of conflict, some sort of resolution. It's the same thing, though, as chronological. You're telling a time-based pattern. You are ordering your main points according to how they occur in time. So I'll be talking about narrative and chronological at the same time. They're very much the same thing. I'll call cause and effect causal. And I won't be talking about Monroe's motivated sequence. Monroe's motivated sequence is a variation of problem solution, and it will be one of the options that you can use for speech number 3. But I'm going to spend more time talking about Monroe's motivated sequence when we get to speech number 3. So I'm not going to discuss it in this video. The only one that I'm going to be discussing that doesn't appear in the textbook is pro-con. So pay attention to that, and you might want to use pro-con in your speech if you think that's effective. But it's not talked about in the textbook. Okay, so that was just a little review of what you read in the textbook, and just a reminder that what I'm talking about in this lecture goes along with Chapter 8. Okay, so back to my slideshow. I'm going to talk about these ones here. And let's begin. I'll tell you a little bit about each one, and then I'll give you an example of it in action. These aren't rocket science, and hopefully these are somewhat familiar to you. If you've taken a composition course or just any kind of literature or writing course, you likely used these in previous work. Anyways, starting with chronological, the word chronos, meaning time, logical order. So this is time-based ordering. And this is going to work particularly well for events that occur in time. And when we're telling about something that occurs across time, we want to be clear to our audiences. Start with the first things first, move to the next things next, and end with the last things last. In other words, don't treat this like you're an avant-garde filmmaker who's trying to wow us with your use of time. It makes no sense to scramble up the time. You want your audience to be able to follow along through time in a somewhat linear fashion. And this is going to work particularly well for time-based topics. So if you have an historical topic where you're talking about a series of historical events or the unfolding of an historical event, then this particular pattern might work well for you. That goes also for biographical speeches, a speech about someone's life, and process speeches, demonstration speeches, or what we might call how-to speeches. You want to tell us how to do those steps in the order in which it's going to occur in time. Not really that mind-blowing, but it does have some difficulties with this strategy that I'll talk about in a second here. Here's an example of chronological ordering. Thesis statement: the addition of a new Las Vegas stadium will occur in 3 major phases. Main point number 1, the first phase is planning and development. Main point 2, the second phase is the construction phase. And main point number 3, the last phase, is staffing and personnel. By the way, what you're seeing here is what's called parallel construction. Parallel construction or parallel language is where you use a similar pattern of wording for each of your main points. And that's a really good idea for you as a speaker, because it's going to help you memorize and be able to reproduce these main points with very little effort. And so you have this parallel pattern. The first phase is, the second phase is, the last phase is. That will also help the audience follow along and be able to retain your main points, which if they can remember the thesis and the main points of your speech, you've done a pretty good job. You've actually informed them about something that they're able to remember and reproduce later. So try to, when you're crafting your main points, to follow a similar pattern of wording in the construction of each of these points. Okay, so this is an example of chronological ordering because it's demonstrating a process or talking about a process in the order it occurs in time. The difficult thing I think about chronological ordering is, like, if you're building a stadium, there's much more than just 3 steps involved in building a stadium. You know, depending on how you break it down, there could be thousands of steps involved in building a stadium. So your challenge when using chronological ordering is you got to reduce the multiple different steps or the multiple different events in someone's life down to 2 to 4 main points, which means you're going to have to lump a bunch of events or a bunch of steps into groups of steps, or as I do here, into phases. Or we might talk about the stages of someone's life or the major turning points in their life. It's up to you to kind of reduce the flow of events down into 2 to 4 episodes, eras, phases, stages, moments, however you want to conceive of that, so that you can break the time up into 2 to 4 main points. So that's chronological ordering. The next one we're going to look at is spatial. That's pronounced spatial. It has the word space in it, and this is going to be space-based organizational patterning, using geography and how something is laid out in space to guide you through that topic. And so it's going to work best for topics that are actual places or locations. So if your topic occurs in a geographic space, you can use how that geographic space is designed to guide your audience through the discussion. And generally when you're doing this, you're going to start from the top and go to the bottom, or start at the bottom and go to the top, or start from left and go right, or right to left, or east to west, north to south, south to north, or region to region. You want to start at some starting point and move from that point to the next adjacent point, to the next adjacent point, to the next adjacent point, as best you can in a linear fashion. The whole point of using spatial organization is that hopefully your audience will actually be able to visualize themselves moving through the space as you're moving from each main point to the next. So it makes no sense to scramble around or wander through a space aimlessly. You want to, as best you can, move through it in a line, in a linear fashion. So here's an example of a spatial pattern. In this case, I'm going to be talking about a place. The Las Vegas Wetlands is an interactive park with many special features. And I'm going to have 3 main points. And I'm going to walk my audience through the wetlands. The Las Vegas Wetlands Visitor Center is the first thing you'll encounter. The Las Vegas Wetlands hiking trails, which wind through rare desert marshlands, are accessible from the Visitors Center, and the Las Vegas Wetlands bird watching platforms are just beyond the hiking trail. So I'm taking my audience through the space in a logical, spatial fashion. Now, this example is literally talking about a place, but you can use spatial pattern to talk about a topic that's not directly the space, but might be something that happens in the space. Here's an example. If you were giving a speech, let's say, on cuisine of the world, well, the different types of food are typically organized geographically. They are national or ethnic foods based on people living in a certain space together. So I might use spatial patterning to talk about different types of food. Maybe I want to start in the south with Ethiopian food, move my way north to Italian food, and end my way up even further north with German food. And so I'm moving through these different types of food geographically. Maybe I want to give a speech on the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty. And I could take a look at how the Statue of Liberty is built, how it's designed, maybe starting at the top with the torch, moving down to the crown, and all the way down to her robes, and to her feet, to the pedestal. So talking about the different symbolism in the Statue of Liberty, but using a spatial pattern starting at the top, working my way to the bottom. Lastly, another example of this might be talking about the careers in a restaurant. And I could use the different locations that jobs are typically performed in a restaurant and walk my audience through the restaurant talking about the different jobs at the different spaces. So starting with the host stand at the front of the restaurant, I'll talk about what the host does. Then I'll move to the dining room to talk about the wait staff and the bussers. And then I'll move to the back of the house to talk about the expediter and the line cook and the dishwasher. So I could move through the restaurant and talk about the jobs without necessarily talking specifically about the physical location of the restaurant. So spatial patterning might be useful for you, especially if you're talking about an event, a festival, or something like that in Las Vegas. Causal, the textbook calls this cause and effect, just so you know, but it's also referred to as causal. A causally ordered speech is going to have 2 main points, and it's going to probably be best for talking about the existence of a problem. Why does a certain issue, controversy, problem exist? But generally, you can use cause and effect to talk about why any problem exists. Or anything exists. Why does this thing exist as it does? So a causal speech will have 2 main points: the reasons why something exists and the effects of that something now that it does exist. And this could be arranged one of 2 ways: cause to effect or effect to cause. For informative speeches, I'd recommend cause to effect because that is logical in time as well. Causes come before effects. For persuasive speech, you might say effect to cause, the reason being that the effects are the bad stuff, the harm that's being done, and we want to grab our audience's attention. But for this informative speech, perhaps just use cause to effect. Here's an example. The negative perceptions of Las Vegas held by locals and visitors have a few major causes and a few negative effects. The main causes of negative perceptions are the outside focus on the tourist industry and the image of Las Vegas as sinful. The main effects of the negative perceptions are low levels of local pride and higher rates of crime. So here you see a cause effect. The main point number 1, causes of the problem. Main point number 2, the effects of the problem. Problem solution, again, this should only be used for your persuasive speeches. So don't use this as an informative pattern, but I want to show it to you as a preview of where we're going with the persuasive speeches. Problem solution, you're going to use it to inform or persuade your audience about the nature of a problem and the available solutions. And I'm going to skip through that and go right to the example. A problem solution speech then would have two main points. Main point number one would focus on the nature of the problem, and main point number two would be advocating for a solution to that problem. The poor education system in Clark County is a multifaceted problem with several possible solutions. The education problem has many causes, including lack of teachers, lack of funding, and lack of parental involvement. The education problems can be addressed with a few possible solutions, including better pay for teachers, more funding from lawmakers, and incentives for parental involvement. So two main points again: problem, solution. Pretty simple. Just a reminder, please don't use this for the informative speech. I will be requiring you for speech number 2 to either use problem solution, or Monroe's motivated sequence, which I'm not talking about in this lecture, but was written about in chapter 8 and will be talked about when we get to the persuasive unit. So you'll use either this one or Monroe's motivated sequence for the next speech. Pro-con does not appear in the textbook, but is a very useful approach that you might find to be helpful for your speech number 2, the informative speech. So you may use pro-con for speech number 2. A pro-con is pretty handy because it's going to give you a balanced look at something. You're going to look at the positives of something and the negatives of something. And so it's particularly useful when informing your audience about a debate over an issue or something that has multiple perspectives or sides. But you could really talk about anything with pro-con. You could do the pro-cons of camping, the pro-cons of enrolling in an online class. Pro is going to refer to arguments in favor of what's being proposed. It could also just mean the positive aspects of an issue. Con refers to arguments against an issue, or it could just mean the negative aspects of something. So there'll be two main points in a pro-con speech. The proposal to raise taxes on the mining industry can benefit Nevada, but critics warn that there could be unexpected drawbacks. So you see the kind of pro-con written into that thesis statement. You'll then break that thesis statement into two parts, the pros and the cons. We'll start with the pros. Raising taxes on the mining industry will help generate needed revenue and bring the mining industry in line with taxes paid by other industries. So those are some positive benefits of raising taxes. Some negatives: raising taxes on the mining industry could lead to a dip in mining exports and the loss of mining jobs in Nevada. Two main points: the positives, and the second main point, the negative. So really simple, straightforward approach, but very effective and well-rounded. The last one we'll talk about is probably the most popular, and that is a topical approach to this speech. It's the most flexible, so it's, I would say, the most tempting to use. But to do this well, you've got to have topics that are related to one another. Having random topics that make no sense lined up together or don't flow one into the other is a way to screw up the topical approach. But this common strategy is very flexible because all we're doing is dividing our main topic into several different subtopics. Now, oftentimes these divisions already exist within your topic. Maybe you're going to be talking about different types of abuse. You do some research, you find out that psychologists, social workers have already created categories for abuse, and you're going to use those categories in your speech. So you're going to talk about mental abuse, emotional abuse, and physical abuse in your speech. Other times, though, these divisions have to be created on your own. So you might divide up a group of ideas into different categories that you've designed. Let's say I want to talk about fashion at Electric Daisy Carnival. Well, I haven't found anything in my research that's going to help me break it into different types of fashion trends. So I'm going to observe and make up my own, and I'm going to talk about new fashion trends in body painting, new fashion trends in fuzzy boots, and new fashion trends in angel wings or something like that. So I could create my own divisions. But it's going to work well if those categories are similar. It's not going to work well if they're just random or don't make sense together. Here's an example. This is from the sample student speech. Oscar Goodman played many roles during his life here in Las Vegas. Goodman was a mob lawyer. Goodman was a mayor of Las Vegas. And Goodman was a spokesperson for Bombay Sapphire Gin. So these work because they're all roles that Goodman plays. They're all related to each other. So this makes it a lot more interesting than just having some random information about Oscar Goodman. The speech could have been, let's say, Oscar Goodman's childhood, Oscar Goodman's major roles, and Oscar Goodman's fashion choices. Well, those three topics are really three different speeches and should probably be focused on one at a time in different speeches. And trying to do all three of those, they don't flow into each other. They don't make sense together. That's a bad use of topical organization. So just to review, we talked about chronological, spatial, causal organization, pro, con, and topical, and those five you can use for speech number 2. You should use them. You should choose one, and it should be pretty clear which one you have chosen based on how you've organized your speech. The 6th one, problem solution, we'll save that for speech number 3. All right, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful to you. Have a wonderful day.